Welcome to our talk Out of the Plane, Flowers versus Star Glyphs to support high-dimensional exploration in two-dimensional embeddings. My name is Christian, and in this talk I would like to show how glyphs can help to find insights in high-dimensional data. Let's say we are looking at a dataset like the one right here. Some tabular data from which we would like to find some insights. Since finding insights in such data can be challenging, we visualize it. However, visualizing high-dimensional data is complex. One way to visualize is to use projection. So we project the data down to 2D and draw 2D points on the plane. This approach comes with an obvious downside, loss of information. So we asked ourselves, is there a way to preserve this information? We draw inspiration from a concept called stick figures. With stick figures, we draw connected lines consisting of segments. Each of these segments encodes one value in the angle of the segment. When we draw one stick figure per data point and arrange them onto a plane, we end up with something like this. This is an example taken from the original stick figure paper. Here, the stick figures are arranged in a regular pattern. We can see that the figures can form a strong visual pattern. However, from related work, we know that there are better visual channels to encode data than angles. We know that precision is a strong visual channel. Therefore, we don't want to use a regular grid, but we use the features of dimensionality reduction to help us to identify groups. For example, here we have a group of 3 points on the left and a bigger group of points on the right. While it's interesting to see that we have two groups, we have no idea why these groups form. So our idea is as follows. We take the original data on the left, as seen before. Additionally, we apply a dimensionality reduction to get positions. Here shown on the right. We then use the positions to draw glyphs, in the simplest form just dots, but we replace it with real glyphs. We encode the raw data into little glyphs. These ones are here called flower glyphs. And in this example, we can already see the benefit of our approach. While we could identify two groups, we need to figure out why these groups form. Here, using the flower glyph, we can see that the data dimension to the upper left seems to have a different value, a lower value in that case, for the three groups on the glyphs on the left compared to the ones on the right. So the main research question could be formulated as follows. Can we encode additional dimensions into two-dimensional embeddings? We already talked about the glyph design. Since the angle is not an ideal design choice, we looked into other glyphs designs and ended up with the following glyphs. The first glyph is the star glyph. This glyph encodes 3 values in a radial design. Here, the values for each dimension is encoded into these star arrays. In this example, A and B would encode the largest possible value, like 100%. And C would encode like a 50%, about 50% value. This glyph design, however, comes with one main drawback, and this is that individual dimensions are not drawn independently, but rely on the 2 dimensions to the left and right. As shown here, for example, B is affected if A is no longer encodes like a large value. In the extreme case, that would mean if, for example, A and C would encode the value 0 or a really small value, and B would encode the value 100 or the biggest possible value, then the array would get incredibly thin and therefore very hard to see. So we came up with a second glyph design, and this glyph design is called flower glyphs. And I guess you can see where the name flower glyph is coming from. We have these individual petals one for each encoding dimension, and the size of the petal increases as the encoded value increases. And you can already see that these petals are drawn independently of each other. So we have two glyphs design, the star glyph here shown on the left and the flower glyph shown on the right. But when we come back to our research question, there is another aspect to this question, like the S here in dimensions. So we asked ourselves, what about the dimensions? How many dimensions can we encode? So we use the following numbers of additional dimensions encoded per glyph or encoded into the glyph. We start with the 3 dimensions that we have seen already on the left. The star glyph defines this lower limit, since you can't draw a star glyph with only 2 variables or with only 2 dimensions. And we use up to 13 dimensions per glyph as an upper limit, shown in the rightmost column. This upper limit is defined by the flower glyph, since the individual petals of the glyph would start to touch each other, to overlap each other. To limit the number of variables in our studies, we increase the number of dimensions in steps of 2. So we use 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and 13. With that, let's talk about the methods of our study. First, we defined a set of hypotheses. We start with our leading research questions. Do flower and star glyphs support the communication of additional dimensions in 2-dimensional embeddings? And with that, we came up with the first hypothesis. That is that we want to preserve the position. So when we replace a simple dot-based encoding with a visual complex glyph, we want to ensure that the ability to estimate the two-dimensional position on the plane onto which the markers are drawn are still there. Since our glyph are a radial design with a round outer shape, we suspect that our glyphs will preserve this position estimation. The second hypothesis is about quantification. The main reason to use the glyphs in the first place is to allow to read up values from those glyphs. And since related work could find that radial layouts can effectively communicate or can be effective for reading up values, we suspect that our glyphs allow to read up individual values. The third hypothesis, we suspect that our glyphs support the identification of high-dimensional patterns that are not encoded into the embedding position or in the 2-dimensional embedding. So as already mentioned, we took inspiration from the stick figures, and while we are not using a regular grid, we still argue that our glyphs form a visual pattern that allows us to identify something like outliers, since they break this visual pattern. And lastly, the final hypothesis that goes even beyond the third hypothesis. We further argue that the glyphs do not only allow to identify patterns in one dimension, but in multiple dimensions. For example, to see if 2 variables show a correlation. To investigate these hypotheses, we ran 3 experiments. In the first experiment, we aimed to find how many dimensions can be encoded into the glyphs. This experiment also had a second goal, that was reducing the number of variables for the remaining experiment. So we don't need to investigate these conditions further if we notice that there is a specific upper limit in dimensions per glyph. In this experiment, we used a task where participants needed to estimate the average value for a given dimension, let's say A, from a group of glyphs. On the right here, we can see an example used in this experiment where participants needed to estimate the value for one dimension from those orange colored glyphs. The blue glyphs act as a distractor here. The second experiment aimed to see if glyphs allow for the same position estimation as traditional dot-based encodings. The task we used was to estimate the number of positional clusters And we used both glyphs, and as a baseline, we used a dot-based encoding as shown here on the right. And finally, in the third experiment, we wanted to go out of the plane. And there we used a set of 3 tasks that we identified from related work. And the first task is outlier detection, or finding outliers. So we asked participants to find glyphs that stand out from the others based on their shape alone. On the right, we see an example of this task. Again, we have a target region here, these orange glyphs, from which participants had to select the outlier glyph. The second task was finding subclusters. So within a positional cluster of points, is there a group of glyphs that that shows a different shape compared to the rest of the cluster? In this example on the right, this could be the group of glyphs in the upper left, showing smaller values than the other glyphs, for example, on the right. So even though all points form like one unified or similar sized cluster, does this positional cluster split into groups? And the third and final task was correlation detection. And here we tasked participants to decide whether 2 given variables within a target region correlate or not. On the right, we again see an example of a stimulus used in this task. One main goal of our experiments was to be as close to real world as possible. Additionally, since we included a large number of variables in our studies, we needed a large set of stimuli. Based on this, we used the following approach. We first scraped data from data.gov, the US open data platform, and we scraped CSV files because they're easier to handle. Because we had several requirements for our data, like the number of dimensions and the number of data points, we needed to apply a filtering step. Some data sets also showed problems like corrupt files, which we needed to sort out. We further prepared the data sets. For example, when a data set contained more than 13 dimensions, more than we needed, we picked the ones that showed the highest variance, for example, to try to reject dimensions that have a categorical value, for example. After that, we applied the aforementioned dimensionality reduction. In our case, we used UMAP. Before generating our stimuli as described before, using the projected values for the position, and then encode the raw data into the glyphs. After running our experiments, we ran our evaluation to investigate our hypotheses. For the first experiment that investigated the number of dimensions per glyph, we ran an experiment involving 317 participants from the Amazon Mechanical Turk crowdsourcing platform. We used 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and 15 dimensions, as mentioned before. And from our results, we found 2 groups. We found a first group formed by the 3, 5, and 7 dimensions per glyph condition, and a second group with the remaining, so with 9, 11, and 13 dimensions per glyph. And we found significant effects between those groups, and that means that after 7 dimensions, there appears to be a drop in accuracy for this task. And from that, to reduce the size of our study, we concluded that it would make sense to only use 3, 5, and 7 for the remaining experiments. In the second experiments, we focused on the preservation of positional encoding. And here we ran an experiment as well on Amazon Mechanical Turk, including 166 participants. And we compared our glyphs to traditional dot-based encodings. And when analyzing our results, we found no significant effect between our encodings. And this supports our hypothesis that glyphs do in fact preserve this positional decoding or encoding. And with these results, we then continued with our out-of-the-plane tasks. And in the third experiment, we used these 3 different tasks that I mentioned. And the first one was the outlier detection, where we included 151 participants, again, mechanical Turk. And we found that flower glyphs indeed outperformed the star glyphs in this task. And we found something even more interesting, that the accuracy in this task even increased with an increasing number of dimensions per task, as you can see here, with an increased number of dimensions per glyph. As you can see here, between 3, 5, and 7, accuracy goes up. Higher is better. And this puzzled us at first, but we suspect this to happen for the reason that these glyphs form these visual patterns, these strong visual patterns, and the more petals or the more star rays are shown in the visualization, the stronger this visual pattern is, and the more an outlier pops out. And the second task was subcluster detection. Here we included 160 participants, also from the mechanical Turk platform. And we found the same effect. And that is that the accuracy even increases, which further strengthens our hypothesis that this is maybe due to this pattern forming effect. And here, why we found that for the dimension with, or for the condition with only 3 dimensions per glyph, the star glyph outperformed the flower glyph. The more dimensions we added, the better the flower glyph performed compared to the star glyph, which means that we think that the flower glyph is a better choice when it comes to encoding more dimensions. And finally, in the correlation task, we included 118 participants from the mechanical Turk platform. And as we already suspected, this task comes with a high uncertainty. While participants seem to be able to find if there is a correlation in this binary task, reliably finding that there was no correlation appears to be difficult. And comparing our shapes with each other, we could not find an effect. With that, I would like to draw a conclusion and give some take-home messages. Generally, we would conclude that our glyphs, or the glyphs, can communicate additional information in 2-dimensional embeddings. When we look at additional dimensions, we found that 7 dimensions per glyph seems to mark somewhat of an upper limit. And we also found some interesting effects that for the outlier and subcluster detection, the accuracy even increased with more dimensions per glyph, which seems to be an interesting direction for future work. When looking at the glyphs, we found that using glyphs instead of traditional dot-based encodings has no negative influence on precision estimation. And when comparing our glyphs, we found that flower glyphs show better results in our experiments, and we therefore suggest to use the flower glyph. If you're interested in more details, you can find the link to the paper under this QR code. Thank you.